Good morning, everyone, and welcome to JRG's webinar for March, where our topic today is qualifying events. Whoops, I didn't know you really meant 30 days. So, again, let's start out with some reminders before we actually get into the meat of today's topic. You will be receiving a copy of the webinar and also a copy of the recording of the webinar several days after today, probably by next Monday, next week, or whatever. Also, any questions that you have, we'll answer them for you, and we'll include a Word document with those Q&As on that. So, before we start, we'd go ahead and like to welcome our partners that we have participating today. Again, these are all of our partners that we really treasure that help us, do our business the best that we can, and we hope that we're serving you as best as we can. So our agenda today, today we're going to be talking about what are known as qualifying events under the cafeteria plan. And if you participated last month, we kind of went over cafeteria plans and what they are and all the requirements. But we mentioned that there are specific reasons as to why an employee can make a mid-year election change. Key thing to remember during today's presentation, when we talk about mid-year, that doesn't mean in the middle of the year necessarily. As soon as the first day of your plan year is done, any changes that would be requested are considered mid-year, even if it's only one day past. So we're going to be recapping our cafeteria plans, talking about this dual analysis you have to do, mid-year election changes, how you should be administering them, and then we're actually going over almost all of the 16 reasons that the IRS permits a change. So recapping, what is that cafeteria plan? Really, as a reminder, it's not a benefit in and of itself. We mentioned last time, you can't get medical care or dental care there. However, it's a funding vehicle for employees. It gives employees the opportunity to go ahead and elect the option between cash, which is a taxable benefit, and then non-taxable benefits. It's subject to Internal Revenue Code 125, and that's why some of us call them 125 plans, and it has to meet all of those regulatory requirements. We also know the last time it must be set out in writing, so you have to have that plan document. And we really did stress, no document, no cafeteria plan, no tax benefit. So you want to make sure that you get this plan in writing. And then we talk about certain provisions, and probably the provisions we're going to be most concerned about are these mid-year elections. So again, it's a benefits financing plan. The key thing is, remember with your plan administration, you have to operate in accordance with the plan document and the IRS rules. So when we're talking about all of these changes today, I'll mention so many times, remember, you need to have it in your plan document. If it's not in your plan document, you can't do it. So the key thing is, changes or elections are generally irrevocable for the period of coverage. And generally, mid-year election changes aren't permitted. So let's go ahead and start. So we're having a little bit of technical difficulties today, so just please be patient with us. Okay, so here we go. We're able to move that slide. And again, I apologize for any technical difficulties we're having today. So let's sit back and think for a minute. There you are, you're sitting in your office, and you get a call or a visit from an employee saying, I don't like that high deductible health plan I'm in. I want to change to the PPO. So your panic button is pushed. You start flipping through manuals, afraid of giving an incorrect answer. So it seems like a simple question, right? But not necessarily so, because employees generally pay for their benefits on a pre-tax basis. We have to do what is considered this dual analysis. Anytime we get a question like this or any other similar questions. And the first part of the analysis is, under the group health plan, what do the terms of the group health plan say? Does the group health plan permit us to make the change? So you're looking at the terms. Does your high deductible plan say, yep, an employee can drop and go to another benefit option? Other things that you would look at under your terms of your plan. When is it permitted to add another person? You get those questions all the time. Or when can someone go ahead and change levels of benefits, just like in our example? So to allow any exceptions, you always have to remember, first, the group health plan must allow it. I have an administrative tip here that, again, just always like to remind employers that the federal law is a basement. A group health plan can never provide less than the federal law requires, but generally it can provide for more. That's the group health plan, not the cafeteria plan. So, continuing with our dual analysis, we've started it. And so let's say that the group health plan does allow our employee to drop that high deductible health plan and go to the PPO. Now we have to look under our cafeteria plan, especially if it was paid on a pre-tax basis, to see if the rules under the cafeteria plan permit the change. And if the cafeteria plan says, well, what's the reason? And if the employee just says, I just don't like it, do you think the IRS says, okay, employee just doesn't like it, he can make a change? Probably not. So again, our analysis has to be, does the group health plan permit it? If yes, does the cafeteria plan permit it? If no, then the change can't be made because it's paid on a pre-tax basis. If yes, then the change can be made. So what we draw attention to here is, remember, the group health plan may permit the change, but the cafeteria plan doesn't, or vice versa. Cafeteria plan permits the change, but the group health plan doesn't. So the key thing is the dual analysis is not required if the benefits are paid on a post-tax basis. You really just look at the group health plan then. So let's start talking about these mid-year election changes. As we all know, a cafeteria plan must follow the general principle that participant elections are irrevocable for the period of coverage, generally the plan year, and that's generally 12 months. Now we know that a cafeteria plan may permit an employee to revoke an election during a period of coverage change and make a new election. Section 125 does not require the employer to permit these elections. It's completely arbitrary on your part. You can allow all of the IRS elections, you can allow some of them, and you can say, I don't want to allow any of the election changes. The IRS has now 16 reasons, and again, we're going to go over most of them. So, but when you're permitting change or considering permitting a change for an employee, the general rule is that the change must be on account of and consistent with the reason for the change. And often, but not always, eligibility will also come into play. And I'll try to draw which ones eligibility is applicable to as we discuss this morning. So when determining the on account of, that is relatively easy. We'll see reasons due to life status changes. Maybe they're asking for a change because they got married, or they lost a dependent, or maybe employment status has changed. So that, again, that's easy. But the next element, this consistent with, it gets to be a little bit harder, and it's a little bit more gray area. When we talk about consistent with, we mean, is the change that they're requesting correspond with the reason why they're asking it? Again, the on account of. Now, generally, most employers that I've worked with will put in their plan that they allow this change if it's requested within 30 days. The IRS does not have a hard and fast rule as to this 30-day requirement. So technically, I've seen employers who will put as much as 90 days in for a notification to come regarding a change to the plan. But how the IRS looks at it, they say, again, for it to be on account of and consistent with, it can't be too remote. So the reason why they're asking for the change, if it goes too far out in time, the IRS may deny that. So let's give an example here. So let's say that you have an employee who comes in, and your requirement is, is the 30. And they come in and they say, oh, geez, I got divorced. But I got divorced 6 months ago. Well, isn't it reasonable they should have known they got divorced, within 30 days? And the answer to that is probably yes. So that's what we have to be careful of. And that brings us to our title. This is what we're talking about when we say, oops, I didn't really know that you went to 30 days. Because employees may not always read the information that you give them and think they can come in at any time and make that change. I think it's a best business practice allowing 30 days. I think that's a reasonable amount of time. Again, if you start getting into 60, 90 days, it could be too remote, and then the reason's not on account of and consistent with. The other thing when we're talking about changes, remember, these are not blanket rules. So you may be able to make a change for one reason to the premium pre-tax, but not to the dependent care or to the health flexible spending account. Also, you may be able to make a change to the dependent care and a premium pre-tax, but not the health FSA. So you have to be very careful when you're making these changes. Besides the general consistency rule, there are 4 other special consistency rules which can be applicable. You always look at the special rules before you go to the general consistency rule. And I'm just going to go quickly over these because they can get rather detailed. But the first exception is it's this relaxed consistency rule where it involves disability and group term life. You need to go backwards. Again, that doesn't require a change in eligibility. Just have to be careful with that. The next is dependent care adoption. Generally, a change can be made if it's going to affect a tax application. So the example there would be maybe someone is having dependent care taken out and their child turns 13 in the middle of the year. Well, once they turn 13, we know that we can't use that dependent care anymore, so that would be a reason or a special reason to make a change. Rule limiting election changes due to loss of spouses or dependents eligibility. You need to be careful there because it says you can only make a change for that person. There are no tag-along rules there. And then finally, limitations on changes due to a gain in eligibility under another employer's plan. Now, again, it's more limited as to what type of change can be made. So now let's talk about administering the mid-year election changes. If you have a checklist, you want to make sure that you go ahead and go over that checklist before you start making a change. You want to ensure that all applicable elements are satisfied, again, before permitting it. So you want to look at things like, does the request fall within one of the permitted election changes? Remember, just not liking the benefit anymore isn't one of those reasons. Does it satisfy a consistency requirement? Does the cafeteria plan permit it? Have you amended your plan document to incorporate that reason? Is there some type of certification required? And was the change requested timely? Again, did they come in 6 months too late to ask for the change? So now we're going to go ahead and start talking about the actual 16 reasons for a mid-year election change. And the first one that we're looking at is change in status. Change in status actually brings in about 6 reasons in and of itself. So we're really moving ahead quickly here. So the first thing is, this is applicable to either the employee, his or her spouse, and the dependents. If there's a change in the marital status, a marriage, a divorce, an annulment, legal separation, or the death of a spouse. You need to be careful with legal separation. Pennsylvania is a state that does not have legal separation. If you're separated, that is still your legal spouse and they still retain all of their rights. So you need an actual divorce in Pennsylvania. Legal separation doesn't count. You're changing your number of dependents. You gain a dependent through either a birth or an adoption or placement for adoption. Or unfortunately, there also could be a death of a dependent. And then change in employment status. Maybe you have an employee who is going from full-time to part-time or part-time to full-time. If you're in a union situation, there could be a strike or a lockout. And when we talk about dependents, just going to digress for 1 second, we generally mean a tax dependent under Internal Revenue Code Section 152, except for an accident or health coverage, because we know there that it means any child who has not reached age 27 at the end of the calendar year. So some things to note, though. A decrease in pay is not a loss of employment. I know that's probably the the most frequent question that you as an employer will get. It's like someone has either, they've gone from full-time to part-time and they're still eligible for the benefit, but they're making less money and they want to make a change. Making less money really is not a reason for a change. So something else we also want to think about. So we talk about these change in statuses. So what if somebody is terminated and then you rehire them within the same plan year? There's a special rule on that, and it tells us that if someone terminates and if they come back within 30 days, that they go back into the cafeteria plan just like nothing has happened. They can only make a change if they have been gone for more than 30 days. Sometimes employers have said, oh, I've got this great idea, the employee wants to make a change, we'll terminate him and we'll rehire him in a week. That's called the back door, trying to get to the back door of the IRS, and again, it's not acceptable. So continuing with our change in status, when a dependent ceases satisfying eligibility requirements, and again, we know that now it's every dependent is eligible up to age 26, and we can't require them to be married or a full-time student, so that's a pretty limited change. We have a change in residence. We have to be careful with this one because a change in residence permits a change only if it's going to be affecting, again, the eligibility. So you may have an employee who comes in and says, hey, did you know I moved? And I want to go ahead and change my benefits because, again, I moved and I can change them. So you say, well, where did you move to? Well, I moved a block down. Well, that's not going to be changing their eligibility for benefits. So change in residence means that they've moved and the eligibility for whatever they're participating in is also changing because of that. I'm briefly going to talk about something called a tag-along rule, and that will also be mentioned a little bit later on. With these change in status, some of them permit tag-along. So if something happens to one person, you can bring other people in, but not all of them do, so you need to be careful with that. Our next permitted election change we want to look at is considered cost changes. Now, if there is an increase or decrease in elective contributions, if the employees are required to either make a corresponding change in payment, the employer can automatically increase or make that decrease. Now, what's interesting is it does not have the word insignificant in the actual rules, but it's inferred. So it's basically saying that as an employer, these automatic changes can be made if they're insignificant. So what does insignificant mean? Actually, that's an employer determination because it's really a gray area. Insignificant, you may be changing a copay, and you're changing it from, $5 to $10. Depending on your workforce, a $5 difference may be significant to some people. To other people, it's very insignificant. So again, now you get to be subjective as to making that determination. When you make these automatic changes, it has to be for a qualified benefit, except for a health FSA, so that means it's excluded. And also, again, must be in that plan document. And as I've already noted, determine whether the change is significant. If it is, then participants can make a change. They can actually change their benefits. If it isn't, you as an employer can automatically make an increase or decrease. Where this gets to be a concern with a lot of employers is that at the beginning of a year, you may go ahead and set a premium contribution for your employees, and you're fine with it. You're able to live with that. And then maybe you hit on economic hard times and say, geez, the employee has to contribute more. So the question becomes, can I go ahead and just pass that change on to them? And again, generally, we look to see, is it significant or not? If it's insignificant, then yes, you can automatically do it. If it is significant, then you have to go ahead and permit them to make changes. Continuing with cost changes, when we talk about this increase, we're talking about the amount of their elective contribution. Someone said, I'm taking out $100 to pay for the benefit. Now is it going to be increased to $110 or decreased to $90? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about an increase or decrease. And the rule generally applies regardless of whether it's a result of an employer action or an employee action. So an employee action, employee goes from full-time to part-time. There's going to be a change there or whatever. And if they're still eligible for the benefits, you want to go ahead and see if that's significant or not. As an employer, again, you may go ahead and be changing the employee contributions, and you want to see if that's significant or not. The next bullet point, this is really, it's a gray area, because it's kind of like the IRS is talking out of both sides of its mouth here, and they've informally commented that the rule does not apply to dependent care provider costs, but then at the same time it says, geez, you may be able to change dependent care based on another reason under the IRS permissible reasons. So it's kind of like they're wishy-washy there, so you need to be careful. The next area that we're going to talk about is a significant cost change. A cost for a benefit package option significantly increases or decreases during a period. And when this happens, the cafeteria plan can permit the employee to make a corresponding change in election under the cafeteria plan. So they can either go ahead and commence participation, meaning if they weren't in it before, now they can go ahead and elect the benefit and do it on a pre-tax basis. Or if it's an increase in cost, they can revoke an election for that coverage. Now, if they're going to go ahead and receive it, it has to be on a prospective basis only. Remember, we generally can't do anything retroactively. And another key here is if we're going to permit them to drop coverage, they can only drop it if no other benefit package providing similar coverage is available. So if you have two benefit options and there is one that has a significant cost change, if the employee is eligible to go into the other benefit option, the only way they can drop their current coverage is if they go into that other option. And there's no cost component reasons here. So even if that other benefit option is more expensive, if it's still available, it means that they're available to them, so they can't drop that other coverage. So when we're looking at our significant cost changes, there are several elements that have to be met. It has to be an eligible qualified benefit, and that's other than that Health FSA. And again, our plan document, it has to be included in there. It has to permit it. It has to be significant. And then a determination must be made whether any alternative coverage is similar. I mentioned that and I kind of like slid over it on the last page. But when we're looking at the other coverage, we talk about similar coverage. So we're going from a medical plan or a major medical plan to another major medical plan. We're not going from something like a major medical plan to a Health FSA because that's not similar coverage. We do know that significant cost changes would be a reason for an employee to make a change under dependent care. So the example for that might be is that, geez, I've been taking my child to this daycare center, and I walked in today, and they told me that the price is going up $600 a month. Well, again, I think if you look at that subjectively, that's probably pretty significant, and a change would be able to be permitted. So next we're talking about coverage curtailment. What is significant curtailment? It's when coverage under a plan is significantly curtailed such that there is an overall reduction in coverage provided under the plan so as to be considered a reduction in coverage. So that's the key thing that we have to remember. And when we're talking about significant coverage curtailment, we look at it in two aspects, either without a loss of coverage or with the loss of coverage, because based on that, it will depend on what kind of changes can be made. So without the loss of coverage, the employee, spouse, or dependent can revoke election for that coverage, and again, elect to receive coverage under another benefit plan that provides similar coverage, major medical to major medical. If there's a significant curtailment with the loss of coverage, the employee, spouse, or dependent can revoke an election, And again, receive coverage prospectively under another benefit option. But if there isn't another benefit option, they can drop the coverage completely then. So when we're looking at, again, significant curtailment, what do we have to take into consideration? Again, it's an objective analysis. Look at the plan as a whole and not just how it's affecting one individual. Because if we looked at each individual, we could find a lot of reasons that something has been curtailed based on someone's personal subjective analysis. So what about, is it change in network providers? That could be a possibility. If a whole network is dropped, that could probably be reducing a benefit. What about if it's a change in one physician in a physician network? Probably not, but again, it depends. What kind of area are you in? Are you in an area where there's only 2 doctors there and dropping 1 is pretty significant? Are you here in Allegheny County where there are lots of doctors, and if 1 would drop all the network, you probably wouldn't even notice it? And loss of coverage, when we mean that loss of coverage, it means complete loss. So if a benefit option has been completely dropped. So the next reason is this addition or significant improvement of a benefit package option. So a plan can be drafted to permit a participant to make certain election changes mid-year on account of an addition or significant improvement of a benefit option package. So basically what we're talking here is that you as an employer, maybe you started out with a high deductible health plan, and you've determined that a PPO might be a better benefit option, and you want to go ahead and offer that after a couple of months. So that's the type of thing that we're looking at. So, and even a benefit option, it can even be an existing benefit. Maybe you had that high deductible health plan and the deductible was $5,000. Now you're changing it to $4,000. That's a significant improvement, so it could be a reason for a person to make a change. So when this happens, a participant can revoke an election and make an election on a prospective basis. Again, always going forward for the coverage under the new or improved benefit package. And this is regardless, again, of whether you already had that benefit out there. It doesn't have to be actually brand new. It can be something that you've just improved, that you've had all along. And again, this is whether or not they previously made an election. So if someone said, geez, I don't want to be in that because those benefits just aren't good enough, and you improve that benefit, I now have the opportunity to jump into the cafeteria plan. So let's jump back to that discussion on the dual analysis. Remember, not only does the cafeteria plan have to permit the change, but the group health plan has to permit the change. So is the terms of your plan say that an employee can change benefit options mid-year? If the group health plan doesn't permit it, then you can't permit it through the cafeteria plan. The key thing is check your insurance contract. See what your carrier allows. And we're going to mention that a lot because I've been reviewing some plan documents and summary plan descriptions, and employers want to go ahead, some employers want to go ahead and permit all these changes, but when we look at the terms of the group health plan, it's not there. So we have to say, geez, you have good intentions, but it's not going to work. So be careful when you're either drafting your documents or reviewing your own documents. Changing coverage under another or other employer plan. And I'm sure this is the one that you've all anxiously been waiting for. This is the one you're most familiar with. And it talks about election lock. So an employee can make a prospective election change on account of and corresponding with a change made under another employer plan. So this is where you as an employer, you have a January to December plan year. And you have employees and they've made elections. And then you have an employee comes in and says, well, gee, my spouse's plan starts in March, and it really looks good, and I want to go ahead and change. So in order to prevent this election lock, because either the employee would say, I can't make that change now, or I may make the change and have dual coverage and pay 2 times, and I don't want to do that. What the rules tell us is that If the other employer's cafeteria plan allows a permissible change, and the other employer's plan has a different period of coverage, not January, it's March, then in order to eliminate the selection lock for your employee, you can go ahead and permit them to drop the coverage and drop a change, again, under the cafeteria plan. And I kind of like threw in that, drop the coverage. Again, make sure your group health plan permits it. Generally, the health plans will permit someone terminating it at any time, but you should still go ahead and check your insurance contract. With this, health FSAs, there's no change permitted. And also, with the dependent care assistance, this could also come into play. So maybe, again, a provider is making a change or whatever. Or maybe now the spouse is eligible for dependent care, and you don't want to be locked into what you've elected, the employee has elected under your plan. So again, just some tidbits to watch with. Now this is an interesting one. The loss of group health coverage sponsored by governmental or educational institution. I'm not going to really go into this because the thing I want to stress with this is the first word, loss. So if someone loses this type of coverage, the state coverage or actually a foreign governmental health plan or whatever, that they may be able to make an election change. You may have got this question, and that's kind of like why I have our go-to jail person here or whatever. So you have an employee who comes in and says, geez, you know, I just elected coverage, and I elected employee and spouse, and happens that my spouse is now in jail. And I want to go ahead and drop that spouse's coverage and make an election change on the cafeteria plan. They're going to be in a governmental program because they're in jail, and they're getting that state coverage. Can I make the change? The answer is actually no, because this requirement says loss of the coverage under a governmental plan. In that situation, if somebody's going to jail, they're gaining that coverage. And again, you can't make the change. Got to be careful, though. That might trigger a special enrollment right also if they lose the coverage. We're talking about HIPAA special enrollment rights. Special enrollment rights, the first key is, does not apply to what's considered those accepted benefits, dental, vision, a health FSA, because they're not subject to the portability rules. Again, we have to draw your attention. Remember, the federal law is a basement. It says you can't go below here. There's nothing that says you will permit a special enrollment right based on, for dental vision, not a health FSA, but dental or vision. So again, you have to be careful with that. And I know many employers automatically think when you think of special enrollment rights, the dental and vision, but technically they don't, they're not applicable under HIPAA. Under a HIPAA special enrollment right, no changes to a dependent care, but there can be possibly changes to the health FSA. Special enrollment rights come into play under 3 different circumstances. When there's a loss of other coverage, when you gain a dependent, or when an individual becomes eligible for state premium assistance. So we talk about you're going to be able to revoke an election for coverage and make a new election. The other thing I want to mention here is, I'll mention when we talk about birth. So again, those are the 3 reasons why we can make those changes. Again, have to remind you about that dual analysis. Look to see if the plan permits it. Look to see if the cafeteria plan permits it. Now, I can tell you automatically, I know your group health plan will permit it because federal law says if your employee experiences any of these, then you have to allow them. Now, under your cafeteria plan, you don't have to permit that change. So what would you be doing for the employee? You wouldn't be allowing them to do any election on a pre-tax basis. So whenever I counsel with employers, I always say, I think this is at least one thing that you should permit because, again, you just don't want to have bad morale out there. So let's talk about this loss of other coverage under special enrollment rights. This becomes applicable when an employee has waived the group health plan coverage at the time that they become eligible, and they waive it because they either have other group health plan coverage or other health insurance. And then, for whatever reason, they lose that health insurance or health coverage, and they want to come on your plan. So that's a special enrollment right, and that is a reason to come on. So when we talk about this loss of coverage, it means if someone is covered under COBRA, that they have completely exhausted all of their COBRA rights, the complete 18 months. If the coverage was non-COBRA, it was terminated because of a loss of eligibility for coverage. Maybe, again, the employer permitted part-time employees to participate, and now it's not, so that would be a loss of, now they don't, that's a loss of coverage. And if it's non-COBRA coverage, if employer contributions for the coverage is terminated, and that means terminated completely. Oftentimes, an employee will come in and say, well, you know, my spouse's employer, they used to contribute 100% to it, and now they're only contributing 75%. So that's a loss of coverage, and I have a HIPAA special enrollment right. And unfortunately, the answer is no, that isn't. Even though the benefit was reduced, it's not a loss of coverage, so no special enrollment rights exist. So under the loss of coverage, let's look to see who has a right here. First of all, the special enrollment is applicable to any benefit option that you offer. So if you have 2 different plans, when they have special enrollment rights, they can pick either plan. Also, you can't limit the right to change from one benefit option to another. So I'm on the plan as an employee. My spouse experiences a loss of coverage, wants to come on our plan, and my spouse says, you may not like that high deductible, but I really like it. So get off the PPO and let's go to the high deductible. They have the right to go ahead and make that change. As to who can make the change here, it's the employee, a spouse, and any dependents can go ahead and qualify. And again, they have to be given at least that period of 30 days under HIPAA to make special enrollment right. Now, if it's the dependent that's losing coverage and not the employee, then the dependent and employee can enroll, but not the spouse. This is one of those tag-along rules here. I can bring this person, but not the other person. So our next HIPAA special enrollment rights is when we gain that dependent. When we talk about gaining a dependent, it means a spouse or a child, either, and we're acquiring them through marriage, birth, adoption, or placement for adoption. Who's it applicable to? To the employee, the spouse, and the newly acquired dependent. And that's key, and I'm going to stress that, and we're going to talk about in a minute. Again, extends to any benefit option under the plan. You have to give them at least 30 days to notify you and go ahead and make the change. Now, coverage for birth or adoption has to be retroactive to the date of the event. So, had a child born on June 1st, I don't tell you until June 20th. You have to make that election because I've gained that child back to June 1st. When you're gaining a dependent, birth or adoption, you can make the pre-tax election also retroactive back to June 1st. And this is key because it's different. If you're gaining a spouse, you cannot make the pre-tax retroactive. So my example, I got married June 1st. I come in and tell you on June 20th. Well, you know, I got married on June 1st. I want to put my spouse on the plan. The plan says, the group health plan says, yep, I can enroll my spouse as of June 1st. Since pre-tax can only be prospective, when that employee goes to pay for that spouse's coverage, they can only pay for it on a post-tax basis. You cannot retroactively terminate gaining a spouse through marriage. So I mentioned that. The other thing when we talk about tag-along, so I'll give you another example where tag-along will come into play. Here I am, I'm an employee, and I have a child already. And I have not elected coverage for either myself or the child. And I get married. Wedding bells are ringing everywhere. And I come in and say, well, now I want to go ahead and elect coverage because special enrollment rights, I got married. My spouse is going to come on the plan. But guess what? I also want to put my child on that I didn't enroll before that was eligible. And the answer is no. Under the HIPAA special enrollment rights, it does not permit that tag along. You can only bring on the employee and the spouse. So what you need to be careful is, put your thinking cap on, is there any other reason where maybe I can grab that child and bring them onto the coverage? And a change in status, one of the first things that we talked about, a marriage, it may go ahead and permit you under that change. So I think this is kind of like a warning to say, when you're looking at your changes, you may see a no at first, but don't stop there. Look at everything else, explore all your avenues before you make a definite determination. And finally, under our HIPAA special enrollment rights, this was added basically under CHIPRA. And this is where you're gaining eligibility for a state premium assistance subsidy under either Medicaid or a CHIP program. Now, this HIPAA special enrollment right is a little bit different because the employee or the dependent has the right to give you a 60-day notice, not 30 days like your other special enrollment rights. Again, they're eligible for any benefit option that is available, and this does not apply if your plan is a high-deductible health plan or it's a health FSA. So you need to be careful watching what kind of coverage that you do offer. And of course, it doesn't affect dependent care. So moving on, we're now going to COBRA, and I'm not going to have a lot of discussion here. So as the drafter of your plan, you can make certain changes mid-year on account of COBRA qualifying events. Or again, you can design it not to permit it. And this includes health FSA under COBRA. It is only applicable to the employee when the coverage is under your plan. So you can't have an employee come in and say, my spouse lost their coverage under his or her plan, and so now I want to change my election so I can pay for his or her COBRA under our cafeteria plan. It doesn't work that way. So if your dependent is going to be eligible for COBRA because they've aged out, you could pay for that dependent's coverage using this qualifying event. Again, it's another kind of like sticky area. You don't see this a lot. And then finally, we have judgment decrees or orders. Again, not really wanting to go through all of this specifically, but I think the key thing that you have to watch for is more or less what we call those QMSCOs, a Qualified Medical Child Support Order. If the order says to change you can change the employee's election to provide coverage for a child, you can also then change the health FSA. Also, under a judgment or decree, you can go ahead and cancel the coverage for the child if the order requires the other spouse or former spouse to cover the child and that coverage is provided. And when this happens, it does not permit the change to the health FSA. And again, no dependent care changes. I think this is another option where when you're drafting your cafeteria plan, you want to go ahead and permit this. You don't want to be in a situation where you've denied an employee to go ahead and make an election change such that they can do a pre-tax contribution based on a QMSCO, and you get that court order, the employee has to cover a child, and here they have to pay for it post-tax. Again, that just creates bad morale, bad relationship between an employer and employee. So another qualifying event I would say to go ahead and include. Under Medicare or Medicaid entitlement, if the employee, spouse, or dependent, if they become enrolled in Part A or Part B, then they have a right to go ahead and make a prospective change, cancel the coverage. And also they'll probably be able to cancel it under the group health plan. If they've been entitled and then for some reason they lose that coverage eligibility, then they can also make an election to go ahead and come on the plan. So they can increase their health FSA also in this situation. This is another one of those, whoops, I really didn't know you meant 30 days here. Oftentimes, and I don't know if it's because maybe when someone is becoming Medicare eligible, they're just looking at so many different avenues and options and ideas that they just forget about this. But the scenario is, again, you're sitting in your office enjoying that morning coffee, And the employee comes in and says, well, you know, my spouse is now enrolled in Medicare, and I want to go ahead and drop the coverage and change my pre-tax election or whatever. And you said, okay, well, let's go ahead and start the paperwork. So when did your spouse become enrolled in Medicare? 9 months ago. Well, you can't make that change because it's not on account of and consistent with. And again, we try to help the employees as much as we can, but generally this is not one that we can get around. So just be careful with that one. And as we're dwindling down here, the next one is the HSA contribution. Under the 2007 proposed cafeteria plan rules, this one was added because HSAs were not around when the original cafeteria plan rules were written. And HSA elections, if you as an employer permit an employee to make a pre-tax HSA contribution, then you must allow them to make a change on a monthly basis. It has to be prospectively, and there cannot be a change to the health FSA or the dependent care. Now, you also have to remember no health FSA change. So that means if someone becomes eligible to put money into an HSA mid-year, if they're already enrolled in that health FSA, you can't make the change and permit them to now say, okay, you can do HSA pre-tax contributions. Another area you have to be careful of. And the last two we're going to talk about, the first is reduction in hours. And this change just came about as of September 18, 2014, and it came about because of the Affordable Care Act. Now, we know under the Affordable Care Act that employers are supposed to measure to see if a person is a full-time employee. And if they measure full-time in that look-back measurement period, then you have to offer coverage in what's called the stability period. And what we have found will happen is that an employee may measure full-time, but then they're working and they're not working full-time hours. Maybe they're changing they're just changing their hours again. But here, they're eligible for the coverage and they may be enrolled. And they say, you know, I want to make that change because I'm not making as much money. Not making enough money is not a reason to make a change. So what the IRS said, and again, basically because of the Affordable Care Act, is that if the employee has a reduction in hours because of a change in status, you specifically designated, you were full-time, you were reasonably expected to work 30 hours a week, and now I'm making you part-time, you're not going to be reasonably expected to work 30 hours a week, then an employee can go ahead and make the change under the cafeteria plan. The other element that has to be met, they have to intend to enroll in another minimum essential coverage plan. So they can't just come in and say, you changed my status, I know I'm in a stability period, but I want to change it based on my hours being reduced. Unless they're going to enroll in another plan, the change can't be made. And again, this is not applicable to a health FSA. That has to be in your plan document. So if your plan document is dated 2012, you know that reason isn't in there because it just came about. And then finally, another reason is exchange enrollment. So if a plan permits a participant who's eligible to enroll in the marketplace exchange coverage to drop the employer-sponsored health coverage mid-year if they intend to enroll in an exchange coverage. This only applies when it's either an exchange coverage special enrollment period or the exchange open enrollment. So generally, if you have a calendar plan year, you wouldn't be permitting this change because open enrollment for the exchange falls at the same time your open enrollment falls. This generally occurs when you may have, again, a March plan year or a June plan year, and the open enrollment doesn't start until November on exchange products. So we've come to the point for questions, and I just want to go ahead and mention before we get there, I did not address reasons under the family medical leave to make a change, too extensive for our time frame, and then also I did not include the 401k reasons to make a change, because generally I don't see employers having them in having that reason in their cafeteria plan. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type your question in the question box, and we'll read it, and hopefully I can answer it for you. It doesn't look like we have any questions coming through today, so we're going to go ahead and end the presentation. Maybe we'll just give it here 30 seconds more to see if we have a late question. Okay, during this time, then what I'll remind you is, again, we will be sending out the PowerPoint to you, and we will send you a recording of today's webinar. And the other thing that I want to mention to you, you were probably feverishly taking notes, and I should have said this before. We have an excellent chart, and it talks about all the qualifying events under a cafeteria plan and the reason why you can make change, and we give examples. So if you'd like to have a copy of that chart, and if you are one of our clients, then go ahead and contact your customer service person, and they can go ahead and email that chart to you. It's great. I think it's a great desktop guide that you can use when you have questions. And since we don't have any questions, we are going to go ahead and end our webinar for today. Hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar, which will be on April 14th, and we're going to be talking about DOL audits. They're looking everywhere. Thanks so much, and have a great day today.